Okay, something new. We now have a list of banks. But what if I want to restrict that? Basically put a where clause in my SQL. Remember, the fetch controller allows us to basically go do a select star from our table. What if I want to add a where clause to it and say I only want certain records? You do that with something called a predicate. This is a built-in class that allows you to filter not only core data, but arrays and collections, all the stuff that you have, you can apply that. So if you have a very large array, you can use the predicate class to filter those as well. My source for this is this NSHipster page. It's the same one from last year, and I was impressed because he's updated it. And for every one of these, you can choose either Objective-C or Swift, and he shows you the syntax for doing these things. Here he's just creating a list, but here he's defining a predicate. This is how you define a predicate. Just has a format, and you give it a string and say, give me a list of all of the people or whatever where the first name is Bob, where the first name is Smith. But notice this is using a substitution technique that we'll talk about here in just a second. So these are what predicates look like. They're relatively straightforward, and they're relatively easy to code. Okay. There's a lot of things you can use these predicates for, and there's a lot of different kinds of criteria that you can define, like equal to and not equal to. While I'm looking at it, I noticed a couple of websites that were using double equal to. It's kind of like, well, wait a minute, this is SQL. They both seem to work. And there's an iOS site that this is based on, and this hipster site, both list them the same and don't designate that one's better than the other. It does anything different. I couldn't find anything that tells me they're different. So they're basically interchangeable. It's kind of like the not equal to's. Is one better than the other? No. Same thing here. We can use between. There's a special way to do that. We can have compound conditions. It goes on and on and on. We can do regular expressions, like ends with, contains. A lot of good information here. We're going to be doing simple stuff, just equal to right now. So that site was real handy, and when I looked at it last year, it was Objective-C, and he's already updated it to Swift, so I was impressed. Predicate is built in. What I don't like about what I'm going to be showing you here is that, as Brittany was asking, how are we going to designate which state? We're going to hard code it just to demonstrate how predicates work. We're going to hard code it and say, I only want banks from Wisconsin or Minnesota or whatever it is I want. In the future, and Sean and I are going to have dinner one night and talk about what do you want to learn next semester, or what do we want you to learn next semester. Maybe that's part of it. How do I, what would I do? And Brittany already has an idea as well, using the search bar to make this a little more dynamic. But if we can hard code it, probably won't be that much more difficult to make it dynamic, so that it filters as we go. Okay, so what we need to change, oh, I'm sorry, there's a big note here. And this has not changed in Swift. There is what's the term, a cache that's built into our fetched controller. And remember, caches are just saved copies of stuff. Your browser caches web pages so that when you go back to the page, it doesn't have to reload it, just grabs it right from RAM. Same thing happens here. I think that's where some of the speed comes from, is that there's a cache. And so whenever I go out and get this bank data, somewhere, maybe in the database, maybe in the device memory, I don't know, that data is cached. And if we change the code, as it turns out, if we change the code to do a different predicate, it messes up that cache. So what we have to do is tell this results controller that I don't want you to cache my results. And if you're looking at it, I'm on line 131 in the master view controller. There's the master cache. And you can name this whatever you want. And I speculated last year that maybe we could have different names for different caches, for different results. Maybe. For us, we're just going to tell it, don't cache. My recording from last year said, this may give you a little bit of a performance hit because we don't have a cache to pull from anymore. But this is only, I think, when the app's launching in our case. And we don't have that many records, so this shouldn't have an effect. But the other thing we have to remember is that we are not using a real iOS device. We're using a simulator. And the simulator is actually using our computer's RAM. So the simulator has access to its share of 8 gigabytes of RAM on these machines. A real iOS device doesn't have that much RAM. I'm not an expert on iOS devices, but I think the most RAM they have right now is 1 or 2 gig for RAM. So by making this nil, we'll comment down here in case I ever want to put it back, it was master. By making it nil allows us to experiment with the predicate, with filtering, and filter it one way, then filter another. If you leave this at master, you have to delete the app every single time to delete the old cache because they're not the same and they don't want to overwrite. So by doing this, we can now run our program over and over and over again with different predicates just to test it. Whether that would work if I was modifying the predicate on the fly, I don't know. But this was one that caused me all kinds of nightmares last year, and this year I had to do a search to find it, but it's still there, and we still don't want it. Okay, so that's our first step. Now, we have to somewhere designate where do we put this filtering? And I had to listen to last year's recording because nowhere in my notes did it tell me where to put this. Where does it go? Turns out, it goes in a fairly logical place, right underneath the sorting. We already did some sorting here, and it could go anywhere inside here because really we're just writing some code ahead of time. And we're going to attach it to this fetch request just like we did with our sort descriptors. So it could go anywhere as long as it's inside this fetch results controller property. So let's put it underneath the sorting. In here, the first thing I'm going to do is define the filter. So I'm going to say I'm going to use a let because it's not going to change, at least not while the program's running. This is one of the first things you'd probably tweak. You know what, let's make it a var just so we don't have to remember to do that later. If we ever make this dynamic, this would have to be variable so we can change it. I call it filter. It's just a variable name. You can call it whatever you want. I think last year I called it pred. A lot of the examples you see on the web, they use the same name as the class but lowercase for their variables. So predicate works, pred, whatever. I just use filter because that's what I'm doing. You could use where as a where clause here if you want to think of it that way. And it's going to be equal to an NSPredicate. That's the class that's built in to manage these things. Last year I had an advantage. The students in the class were also in my web data management class. In a web data management, we learned about how to filter data that's coming out of a database, a MySQL database, and do it securely. There is a hacker technique out there called SQL injection where you put specific SQL commands inside of a where clause that basically gives you access to the whole database, even the secure parts of it, and maybe even the database server. So to avoid SQL injection in MySQL and PHP, there are also commands that use parameters. Instead of hard coding, you use parameters. You don't hard code it in your SQL. And you definitely don't use variables that users have typed and plug the contents of those variables directly into an SQL command because that's where users, hackers, can type in some magic commands that they've figured out, basically to create subqueries, and plug them into a where statement if you're not careful. But by using these predicates and using the technique you're going to learn in PHP, you can avoid that so that if they put commands inside there, it won't run them. It won't execute them. It's looking for data. That's kind of what we're going to do here. Our first one, however, is going to be hard-coded. The predicate needs, that's a class, right? So we're going to instantiate it. And the easy way to instantiate it is using the format parameter. In here, you put a list of the description of the where clause, the stuff after the where. If you wish, you can use arguments as in variables over here. But initially, we're going to leave those out, and then we'll redo it with them in. So for right now, for this string, I'm just going to create a string. And in between there, let's say that we want the state to be equal to Wisconsin. And then take the arguments out. There's a lot of flexibility built into this format command. I was pretty impressed with it. I can instantiate it in 2 or 3 different ways, and they all seem to work. A couple things to recognize here. Completely, absolutely case sensitive. You put the S in here, capital S, probably get an error because I can't find that field. So it has to be capitalized appropriately as it is in the data model. If you put a lowercase I in here, lowercase wi, doesn't match anything. They have to match the data. This is completely case sensitive. If you want it to not be case sensitive, then you're probably going to have to write some code. That defines the where clause. How do we apply it? We apply it to the fetch request. Let's just check my notes here. Apply it to the fetch request predicate. So up here, we defined a sort descriptor and we applied it to the fetch request. Now we go back to that fetch request and define its predicate. This is iOS Swift. It can't be that simple. For once, I'm glad to disappoint you. It is. Please. Whew. How do I know those are Wisconsin? Well, last year I had concatenated the Wisconsin to the state name or the city name in my subtitle. But if you look, Racine, Wausau, Kenosha, Stoughton, Burlington, Milwaukee. There's a lot fewer. Well, we know there's a lot fewer, but how do I know that Wisconsin? Yeah, we could verify it if you really wanted to. But it filtered it. So let's try another one. Let's go over here and do Minnesota just to see that we get a different result set. And that by removing the master cache, we can run this now and it doesn't cause any trouble. If you want to try it with the master back in there, go ahead, it crashes the second time you do a filtered search or a filtered execution. Because the cache is still sitting wherever it's sitting. I don't know where it is. Wherever it is, it's still there. It's going, wait, this is not the same cache. I can't do this, crash. Can't really tell that these are Minnesota except the first one. If you know Minnesota, then good. Bloomington's Minnesota, I know that.
Minnesota.
So seems to be working, right? That's what we wanted to know. You want to filter on something else, you can. Okay, I'm not limited to state here. I can filter on city, I can do like clauses, I can use contains, I can use zip codes between this and that one. As long as it's in my lookup table, I can use it. I can look for bank names that contain community. Whatever. This is one way to do it, but it is not, this is reasonably safe. Now, in my listening to last year's recording, I had to laugh. I said, why would somebody want to SQL inject into their iPhone database? You don't. So it's not terribly critical here for security reasons because this database is hard-coded. It's on our device. Now, maybe next semester, probably next semester, we're going to show you how to access a database, a MySQL database, probably that's on the web. And that would be one of the things that I have Sean do. Why do I have to have a hard-coded database when I can have a web-based one? That way I can get at it from my browser and my C# program and from my Android device and from my iOS device, and they can all go against the same database. That's the future. If you're going against the database version, then yeah, I wouldn't want any SQL injection because I might have some security and there'd be ways around stuff. But in this one, since the database is on the device physically, injecting it, hacking your own database doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this is still safe though, because how can somebody insert their own code into my hard-coded MN? They can't. So this is safe. But if we wish, let's take those out. We can put placeholders in. Now, many of you are lab assistants, and you've been listening to me talk about placeholders in the string format command in C#. Kind of the same thing here, except there's only two. The first one is %K. You cannot change that letter. I tried. I want to make it S for state. Nope, 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 nope. K stands for key. This is the key value from the field value, basically, from our database. I think what's happening behind the scenes is that data is getting sucked out of the database and be put into this object, and we want the element whose key will be plugged in here. So you must use %K equals, and then if you want a placeholder for the value, you use %ampersand. That's left over from Objective-C. %ampersand was a placeholder in a printed string for any object. Okay, @ sign. It's the right character, I didn't name it right. Spaces around the equal sign don't seem to matter. Could put a double equal sign there. But now that we have placeholders, we need to have a parameter for each one of those placeholders. So for the key, I want to use name. The key is a string, so I must put quotes around. For the value, I want Wisconsin. I'm going back to Wisconsin now. Good question. Quotes where? Here or here? Shouldn't there be apostrophes around it? When you do this parameterization stuff that we're doing right now, you don't need that. I'm going to say here the fetch request in PHP, the PHP SQL analyzer says that's a string, puts the quotes around it, everything works fine. So no, you don't need the apostrophes. If you put them in there, I don't think it hurts, but you don't need them.
There's no name.
Instead of name, don't want state.
Thank you. Can't tell you how many times I did that last night, still doing it. I think it's because it's so close, it's sitting right there. And we're back again. Same results. But now, again, looking ahead to what Brittany wants to do, I can put a variable name here. I can define a variable called state, put WI in it, and put the variable name here, and the contents of the variable will be plugged in there. I can put a variable here for which field do you want to sort on. Whoa, cool. So now I can mix and match and come up with all kinds of things. The one thing you can't do is define the criteria. Are you looking for equal to, not equal to, less than, greater than? Can't change that. You'd have to have a different predicate. And you might remember that on the hipster site here, he did some examples where he saved 3 or 4 different predicates. Here's the Bob search, here's the Smith search, here's the age search, and he calls each one of those something different. And then he applies them, in this case, to arrays. And instead of putting filter here, we put Bob here, or Wisconsin here, or Minnesota here, and have different kinds of criteria, and just apply that. As in any SQL command, you can have one predicate at a time. It is possible. Oh, by the way, let's go back to my notes now here. Okay, so there's the simple version, and that's fine for me in this chapter. Okay. This is probably a little more appropriate with the %K, %@ sign. Whoops. That's Objective-C. In Objective-C, if you wanted to use a string, you had to put an @ sign in front of it. I missed that. Forgot to take it out. Then the name, and here's a variable. So you can use a variable there. Playing around with it a little bit, I discovered that you can use them in any combination. In my first example, we used none of them. Here's an example where the field name is specified, but the value comes from a parameter. Here's an example where the field name is the parameter, but the value is hard-coded. I don't know, that one doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
The format is just a string, so you could just build a string.
You could do just about anything you want to there.
Instead of using placeholders.
Instead of using placeholders. But the next question that usually pops up in intriguing or in inquisitive minds is, what if I want to have 2 sets of placeholders where this is true and this is true, and I want to use placeholders in all those things? And then you have to use an NS compound predicate, which is like our compound sort. And don't ask me, I haven't done it. I'm happy just to be able to filter it right now. But ultimately, you're probably going to want to create some pretty complicated filtering. So figuring out how to do that now, what Paul said, couldn't we just hard code it and say where the state equals Wisconsin and the city equals Plover? If you hard code it, yes, you can just type it in there with an and all the stuff you know how to do.
Yeah, but you could even put string variables in there.
Inside? Yes.
Because you're generating a string.
Yeah, but there's a couple of sites I hit. So here's what he's saying, by the way, in case you're in the recording. We used to have, let's just do another one here. We had said that give me a list of everybody where the state is equal to, and this is just a string, so couldn't I put a backslash parentheses variable name here? Yes, it works, but I've seen a couple of sites that that's just a bad idea. I don't know exactly why. If you do it this way and it's Wisconsin, I believe you still have to have tick marks around it, because now you're not bringing it in from a variable that's being analyzed as a string. You're hard coding it because your variable name, whatever that is just going to be inserted right in there, so don't forget the ticks. So that gives you a little more flexibility, and you still don't have to go to the compound predicates. Okay, so yes, that's legal. I've seen it on a lot of sites, but I also saw one Stack Overflow site where the guy whose answer was 400 green check marks said, by the way, you're going to see some of these. That's not a good idea. Because it doesn't do that, I forget the technical term he was using, but it doesn't just kind of plug it in. I think all he's saying is don't forget the apostrophes when you're going to do it this way. Use apostrophes if you're looking at text. If you're not looking at text, then you don't need the apostrophes. That could be a number that you're plugging in there.
What if the user typed in an apostrophe?
Mm-hmm.
Would that mess?
I'm guessing it would, wouldn't it?
You'd have validation too. And
Yeah, or you could just do it the right way. And so his point is a good one. If there's an apostrophe potential, like searching on last name, right, or even cities, if there's a potential for apostrophe inside, then you can't have an apostrophe here.
Which, yeah, if you do it this way, you'd have to validate it to make sure.
You'd have to change it, but if I had an apostrophe in there, I'd be using the substitution thing so that the apostrophe goes in there, and I don't have to worry about the quotes and things around it. I don't have to worry about that. In using this technique up here, you don't have to worry about the quotes. And if there's an apostrophe inside my state name or my city name, it'll deal with it just fine. And you don't have to worry about it. So that's the other advantage of doing that technique. But if you have a very complicated query where it's this or this or this or this, and yes, you can use ins and plug things in, but if you have 3 placeholders there, then you got to go to that compound predicate, and that's a little more complicated. I should have figured my 20 minutes that I predicted for this wasn't going to work because of your intelligent questions, but I didn't predict that. Okay, so that's predicates. That's all I know. We can now filter. Tying this into a dynamic filter, not sure how I would do that. Not yet. Next thing we want to do is display the details view. All right, we saw when I was running this that the details view does come up, but doesn't have anything in it yet. So I wanted to save that. So what do we got to do? A lot of this stuff's already taken care of. Well, this I took care of. I added the fields to my details view. I created the outlets just like we usually do because we want to be able to send to them. And you would then have to put in your keyboard dismisser thing. And many of you, by the way, in your Unit 5s are turning them in where you dismiss each text box individually. I think we found a way, I forget what it was already, found a way to do that with one line of code. So just get rid of the keyboard. I don't care who's got it, get rid of it. So there is a way to do that. I think we found it in Unit 4 someplace, or one of you found it. I hope I added it to my notes. Just make it a little shorter. Yep.
Is there any way that, like when you have a text box kind of down towards the bottom of the screen,
get it so the keyboard doesn't cover it up?
Yeah, I talked to Adam. The question, in case it didn't make to the recording, is a lot of times that keyboard pops up and it covers up your fields. It's called poor planning on your part to put them there. All right. But Adam did find a way to hide things that are above and make things kind of, I don't know, collapse and expand is the right word, so they slide up. But he did some pretty intriguing. Did you do that in your 5? In your unit 5? So he'll show it to us next week. And for a small price, he'll probably sell you the code. Okay. So in Prepare Segue, we want to start changing these things. We want to change a few things. And Prepare Segue is in the app delegate. The downside of using these prototypes is it's hard to remember sometimes where all this stuff is hiding. Where's the Prepare for Segue and where's the cell creator? And after you get used to it, I suppose it's not bad. But if we had built these from the ground up and typed all this stuff manually, we'd know where most of that stuff is or have a better handle on it. But no, I said Prepare for Segue. I lied. That's not in the app delegate. That's in the master view. Up a little bit higher. Find our Prepare for Segue. And really all we're doing here now is changing all of the managed objects to our class. So wherever there's an NS managed object, and my notes kind of point out the ones we need to hit, we're going to change that to bank info. Because what's happening here is I am sending something to my detail view controller. I'm going to send an object. So up here someplace there's an object. Where'd it go? Oh, it's defined inside. I just changed it. Duh. Okay, so here the object is defined, and I just changed it as to a bank info. So now I am sending to my detail view controller bank info, a bank info object. That's a change. Later on when we do new, we'll have to change this, but let's save that for next time. Now on the other end, I have to receive that. So let's go to the detail view. And in the detail view, I have a detail item, and you could rename this if you wish. Notice all the outlets are already there. But it's an any object. Doesn't have to be. It can be a bank info object is what you're going to get. Any object is not illegal. It's just harder to manipulate because you have to convert it before you can use dot notation to get at the city and the name and all that junk. You got to convert it. If I say it is, this is called a strictly typed class. It's not some generic any class. It's a strictly typed class, and that gives you, the programmer, a whole lot more flexibility. The other thing to remember, this has been commented out, but we discovered in Unit 5 that if you leave that in there and we use our own objects, it was choking on that. And it did here too. Because when this one would execute when it was creating the form before my objects are even on the form yet. I think there might have been an if statement in there saying if there is a label, then go ahead and configure the view. If there isn't, then skip this. I have not found any ramifications, any downsides to just commenting that out. We still configure the view after it loaded, but after it loaded, at that point, all my text boxes are there. What seems to be happening is when it creates the form, even ahead of time, I send this over and the objects don't exist yet, and then we're trying to reference them. All right, here's my configure view. This had some junk in it to display the date time thing that they had. I took that out. Just like your Unit 5, nothing new there. And so in here, now we want to transfer stuff from the detail item. You know what? I don't like that. Let's change it to the bank. And so now over here I have to say, oops, tell you what, let's leave that one as detail item, undo that. This one is bank. Because notice what's happening, we're unwrapping the detail item to make sure it's there, in case it's not. When we're adding, it won't be there. Just like we did with the index. Take that detail item up there and unwrap it if it exists, call it bank, and process, otherwise skip it.
So there has to be any object.
No, good. Actually, you could, no, you have to designate its type because we're assigning it here. And that one should be bank info. Good. All right, now underneath here, we should be able to say bank.name goes into the text box. So text bank name dot text equals bank.name. City, state, zip. Go ahead and do them. I'm going to stop talking. At this point, we should be able to test and at least see these 4 things come up. The other things that we still have to do, there's just one minor little trick we have to remember, but the other things we want to do are coming from the details view, that bank dates view. So these are in my lookup. Those should be readily available to me. So I should be able to test this. I'm a little leery because when I built this, I already have a finished version of it, and I copied all the objects off the other form onto this one. I had to wire them myself. So a little nervous, but I think it's going to be okay. Go. Cool. Everything's transferring over. Bank names are kind of long, but I don't care. That's not the point here. I got the data in there. Hallelujah. Now these 3 things, again, those 3 things are coming from the other model, the bank dates entity. How do I get access to them? Using the relationships. We use the relationships. So I'm going back into the details view, where I just was. Now I'm going to get the detail dates. And the way I do that is by accessing the bank.dates object. Remember, there's this relationship called dates. Okay. So I'm going to create a variable, actually a constant, because it's not changing, called dates. And that's equal to my bank.dates. Yeah, I probably could just say bank.dates. Probably. Good. So now here I can just say dates, and what Nick was saying is I could leave out the let statement and do a bank.dates.acquiring institution, bank.dates. Stuff. So I'm simplifying just a smidge here, probably isn't necessary. Text acquiring institution dot text equals dates dot acquiring institution. And now things get a little trickier, but not a whole lot. I have text boxes for my dates. When did this bank close? It's a text box for the date. That's a little dangerous. Notice I brought in my date class. We didn't have that the other day. And I just want to show you real quick, there's one minor change I made to the class. When you instantiate my date using an NS date, it used to require the date. Remember, I did a bunch of research on these parameters and when do you have to have a named parameter and when do you have external names and stuff, and I discovered that if I don't want to name it, and I don't, I can put an underscore here, and that says you don't need an external name for this. So I added that underscore to that method so that I don't have to say the date colon, whatever date. So that should save me a little bit of typing, and I think it still makes a lot of sense. Text.date equals an instantiation of my date class, parentheses, with whatever the date is. The date that's coming out of the database has been converted automatically as to an NS date. It's not my date. So what I want here is dates.close. And that's all I need now. My wrapper class for date has made life, what do you mean no?
It's not a string. Or a format.
Luckily, no, I have a 2-string. I think I have a 2-string without any parameters. Yep. Thank you. So I needed to convert it into a string because I'm putting it into a text box. If I had left 2 date pickers on there, but they're huge, that would have been a pain. Left 2 date pickers on there, and I could have transferred it directly without even converting it to my date class, because what comes out of the database is an NS date. What's stored in an in a date picker is an NS date. Would have matched. But here I'm using text, needed my class, text updated, dot text equals the same kind of stuff. Just does not want to pick that for me. Date, dates dot update date, 2-string. And Nick, that's the last command. I think I'm done. So that should work. Just give it a run.
See you later.
Bye. Pick a bank. Everything's there. It was nice that things went well for a change. There was a couple of things I had to fight with, but nothing too serious. All right, not like we had when we were trying to bring in the original data. That was more complicated, and it was complicated last year. But it gives us something to play with. Instead of having to type our own in there and having 3 or 4, we can bring in a pile of them from other sources. And I think it's still a valuable skill to at least see that we didn't do it, right? I didn't have you build the SQLite database. That's its own other challenge. And I'm pretty sure that in OneDrive, here's the Congress make JSON file. Okay, and here's the import Congress file. So what this is probably a C# app that takes a CSV, comma separated values file, turns it into a JSON file like this. Thought I had it here once upon a time. Turns it into a JSON file, and then built into C, or Objective-C and now Swift, is the ability with one command to say, go out, give me that file. One command. It's kind of long, but it's not terrible. Go out to that file, get its entire contents, it's a JSON file, its entire contents turned into an array. That's what this program does.
Built in PHP too.
Yep. That's what's nice. That's what's going to make going to a real database out on the web work. It's also built into PHP. When we go to a real database and say, I want access to my SQL database, we're going to write a PHP file that says, give them a JSON file, we're going to suck that into our device. And what this does is it takes that array, once it's been built, and builds a data object for it. Just like we just pulled the data out, it puts the data in, saves it. Next one, data in, saves it, saves it over and over and over again.
Just to, if you wanted to preload data, just to include the JSON file,
If you had it, yeah.
and that's
I didn't, because the state data came CSV, so I needed something to convert it into CSV. Wenderlich used Perl, which I have no experience in. Python, Perl, whatever, one of those P languages out there. He used that to convert the CSV into a JSON file and then suck the JSON file into Swift. Then it was Objective-C. So I did kind of the same thing, but all that happens, all this program does is it creates that database. And then I went out into that super secret database location and grabbed it and said, thank you. Shared it with people. Took a little while, but if you look, the code's not terrible. This one's C#, should be able to read that one, and this one's Objective-C. It might be a little cryptic, but you probably find your way through it. Unfortunately, they're very specific. This one makes a JSON file out of a Congress database. If it's not the Congress member stuff, this doesn't work. But it gives you the logic, shows you the format. You just change the field names. This one imports it. You already had to create somewhere a data model So you now write a program that says, grab me data and put it into my data model. I make it sound easy. It's not that easy. It was probably an afternoon's worth of work. But I got thousands of records for free that way. And a little experience writing iOS, and a little experience working with JSON, and a little more experience with C# text files. None of which can hurt, right? Okay, I'm going to stop there. In my notes, I have highlighted the save chapter that not chapter, but section that I am on now. Where'd my notes go? So come down a little bit lower. There's all the stuff we just did. Here's where I'm at. Okay. This, back to Objective-C. That's what we used to have to deal with. Look at all the stupid stars and square brackets embedded inside of square brackets inside a curly bracket. Oh my God. Thank goodness all that's gone away. The challenge sometimes is translating this. But now what we have to figure out is, okay, they made changes over here. How do I get those back into the database? And if I read this right, it basically says, give me access in the details view to that managed object, the scratchpad. And once I get the scratchpad done, then somewhere along the way, I have to say, hey, it's changed. Go save it to the real database. Just like we did in C#. We made changes, but then we had to issue update commands through the business class to say, change the database. My scratchpad is changed, now change the database to make it match. And then we still got to cancel and save, and we've got a few other things to do, but we should be able to figure that out. Hopefully that'll go a little bit better. We'll see. So Monday, my goal is to have you show off your Unit 5 apps and the cool stuff that's inside there. I'll have them loaded. They're already loaded on OneDrive. And I'll just download them to my computer here, and you can show them off, and we'll all ask questions, and that'll probably fill the day. Wednesday, I hope to go through this, the save, add, delete stuff, which will leave you about a week to implement the save as delete stuff. So hopefully by Wednesday, you'll be close to done with the show the details view that we're done with now. My goal for you would be to be done with that on Wednesday. If the save, add, delete fails miserably, then you're done. I mean, if it fails for me. If I can't get it done by next Wednesday, I'm not going to ask you to do it. I'll figure it out and share it with you in January or over the break or something. But I don't think it's going to be terrible, because that fetched results controller is still there. It's just in Swift instead of Objective-C, and there might be a few little things I have to do to tweak it. But in general, it should work.